the recording now. Okay, cool. So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for attending this webinar today, Determined to Diversify a New Strategy for International Recruitment. Let me just quickly share my screen so you can see the beautiful presentation. Is my screen shared well? Okay, perfect. Okay. So I'm very excited to host this conversation about the report we previously launched with the Studyportals on this topic and share some helpful insights for diversification. Okay, as mentioned earlier, that we want to make these webinars interactive as possible. So just a gentle reminder again, please feel free to leave any comments or questions in the chat box, and then we will leave some time at the end to go through them together. So to kick off, I would like to take some time to introduce myself and also the co-presenter today, Carmen. So I will start first. My name is Debbie. I'm the Senior Partnership Executive here at Unibuddy. My role essentially is to connect with higher education providers in APAC region, help them better engage with their target audience and support their students throughout their decision-making journey. Before my time at Unibuddy, I was in student recruitment sector for 5 years, so I can really relate to today's topic. Joining me today is the co-writer of the report, Carmen from Studyportals. I will now hand it over to Carmen to introduce herself.
Thank you, Debbie. So my name is Carmen. I'm one of the senior marketing analytics consultants within the Studyportals analytics and consulting team. And well, my role is really trying to get the wealth of data that Studyportals has and turning it into insights either for the industry or for our clients. I primarily work with universities within the Europe region as well as Asia Pacific, North America, UKI, so a bit of everything, I guess I would say. And before joining Studyportals, I was in academia actually, because I was doing my PhD in services marketing and really trying to understand value co-creation. So for me, it's a really interesting topic in terms of how universities can really bring about and create value using diversification as one of their strategic tools. So happy to be here today.
Thank you so much, Carmen. So before we start getting into the core of the presentation, I would like to give a quick briefing of this report. So this report explores how diversification can strengthen your strategy. It also provides the factors and frameworks that university can apply to their diversification strategy. And finally, this report discusses methods alongside differences and similarities across growing source markets that will help you analyze and understand how to reach out, engage, and recruit future students. So obviously, Carmen would take a deep dive into the further details. So before we start from that part, I want to quickly start with today's agenda. Okay, today's agenda starts with why diversity matters and the drivers behind it. Also, the countries we're seeing increase the demand. So you can have basically a list of source countries in mind to take away today. And also what students from these countries are most interested in study. This will help to determine whether or not you can accommodate these interests and consider how you can move to do so. Lastly, how you can apply these insights to bolster your strategy. Okay, so I will now hand over to Carmen for her to walk us through the details. Carmen, over to you. I will stop sharing my screen.
Oh, no worries, I can definitely take over. Indeed, so I do think that we're noticing that diversification is more or less the core of every university strategy at the moment. I think if I look at most university strategic plans, they do mention internationalization, but also especially diversification. And I do think, especially with the changing global context, it's really been seen as a really good way for universities to kind of future-proof their strategy. traditionally, it has been a really good way of promoting access to higher education, inclusion of different perspectives, and really of creating equity across all institutions. And of course, I don't think you would be here if you didn't believe in the importance of diversity. So we do have a bit of a bias, of course, a positive bias towards diversity. But we also wanted to make it a bit more practical. And that was also one of the key aspects behind the report in terms of, okay, we all agree diversification is important. How do we actually take advantage of it? So how can you make it translate into opportunities for your institution? And especially today, we look a bit more into the geographical part of differences, although in the report, we do make it very clear that diversification is so much broader in context, but we did have to start somewhere, and we did have to focus somewhere. So that's why we chose the geographical angle. And how can you take that into your university strategy and service offering? Now, there's so many reasons why institutions choose to diversify, but depending on your key driver or main motivation to do so, it does change the shape of the strategy you're going to be approaching. Or the angle you're going to be approaching it by. So let's say, if we look at the knowledge-based economy, of course, we always know that highly skilled graduates are really essential to the workforce. They're more likely to work in international firms. That kind of helps with overall the country being more globally connected to other nations. And if that is one of the main reasons why you choose to diversify or focus on diversification at your campus, then you're also going to be aware of the fact that multicultural awareness and the ability to work with international team members contributes to this skill set. So therefore, when you're going to be developing your portfolio, you want to provide opportunities for students to develop and kind of hone those skills. But let's say if your focus is more on the quality of the classroom experience, so if your motivation is believing that international students enrich the debate within the classroom, they add different perspectives, maybe provide some insights for the professor teaching the class, and therefore some research insights to take a different angle into maybe something they're already doing, then of course, the way to do that might also be to expose students to multicultural experiences, to develop their awareness. So maybe you'll want to add some kind of cultural awareness classes to your curriculum to kind of bring that about, maybe some experiences of going abroad or kind of bringing different perspectives also from the local community. So I think basically depending on the main reasons you choose something, the approach will be completely different. And I think especially these years, we've seen diversification as a really critical tool for risk diversification. And that is because, of course, we've seen that if boundaries close for any particular reason, if borders are not open, if a few countries change their internationalization policy and they decide maybe they do not want to collaborate with another one, then does expose a lot of risk in terms of, well, if 20% of our recruitment is dependent on one country, that is, of course, risky for the long term. And you do want to have options in terms of how to approach that. So relying on a limited number of source countries is, not ideal, although we know that the reality, of course, is that there are a few sending countries which provide the bulk majority of students in particular destinations, but also in particular courses. So, we know that business schools really apply to, appeal to Indian students, and therefore there's kind of a natural inclination towards certain disciplines, certain destinations. But the more you expand the options you have in terms of recruitment, the more future-proof you can be in terms of resilience. Now, and of course, if we look at the other side of it, so if we look at rankings and reputation, we know that, of course, there's a lot of top talented students among overseas students. We know that the percentage of international students within your institution makes up of one of the dimensions that quite a few of the rankings use. So therefore, the more international students you have, or the more diverse we are, depending on the ratio of students to faculty, that can really also help with your overall ranking positioning. But I think also in terms of reputation, if you do position yourself as a really incredibly international environment, it does help with your branding, with your overall positioning. So there's a lot there in terms of why do we do it and how do we do it. Of course, there's so many secondary motives as well, but let's not get into everything, because I think the important part for today is also, okay, so what will the class of 2030 look like? And yes, it depends on your motivation. And it does depend quite a lot on what is the strategy of your institution, but it also depends a lot on what is possible within the source countries, because you cannot have one without the other. To bring it to life, you do need to understand the market. You do need to understand what are possibilities for recruitment. You do need to understand which countries are more interested in my destination, which countries are interested in particular disciplines. Is that growing? Is it changing? Are we going to see a boom of students in particular source countries, or maybe is there going to be a decline in some of the big countries that we're used to recruiting from, and do we need to start diversifying with other countries? And I think the challenge for everybody in the audience, and I do think it's difficult, but I do think it's also an exciting challenge. You do need to make sure that you start getting the right mix of demographics, growing population, purchasing power, economic growth, government demand. There's so many different elements to how you're going to approach diversification. On one side, it does make it challenging, but I do think it also makes it exciting. It's like a big puzzle to try to figure out. And in this report, we did try to look at quite a few countries. And of course, I think beyond India was an interesting region because, of course, everybody knows India is a huge source market. But we did want to look a bit at the outskirts of, okay, so what is happening in Sri Lanka, what is happening in Pakistan, what's happening in Bangladesh and Nepal, because I think sometimes these countries get a bit overlooked. They're still really big recruitment countries, I think especially for Asia Pacific universities. But for instance, for a European university, Nepal is probably a lot more exotic, let's say, in terms of diversification than a country like India would be. We had the same with beyond China, because of course, we do know that China is sending a significant amount of international students abroad, although we've seen that number decreasing and kind of stabilizing. We've heard quite a lot of worries and kind of alert systems from both American universities, British universities, Europeans, Australians, saying the amount of interest we're used to getting from China is not necessarily there. So where else could we look at? And in the report, we did explore Vietnam, Singapore, Philippines, Thailand, and Malaysia as possible source countries. Of course, none of them can really replace source countries large as China, but it is interesting to also understand that just because geographically countries are in a similar area, they do not necessarily work or behave or think or prioritize the same things. And we'll get into that a bit. And within Europe, and that is an interesting one, because again, it's all relative. If you're a European university, then recruiting from Portugal is just second nature. It's just one of your 20 countries of focus within Europe. But if you're an Australian university, Portugal is an interesting country that maybe you haven't explored yet. And the same with Poland, Greece, Romania. There are countries with fairly young populations that do want to go study abroad, but their main focus has been destination Europe, but that does not mean that they could not be interesting for other destinations as well. And last, we had an interesting mix of countries because we couldn't place them in any one type of region, in that they're so interesting on their own. They're quite peculiar in certain aspects. So for instance, Japan, we could have included it with beyond China, but it's such a different type of source country that we thought it should stand on its own. It was the same with Ghana, with Turkey, and with Brazil. They're really interesting up and coming countries, and you'll see a bit of the peculiarities in a bit. Now, why did we choose all of these countries? It's because we wanted to provide a bit of everything for everybody. So some of these countries are interesting from a geographical perspective. Some of them are interesting because year on year, we're seeing a significant amount of interest growth from these countries to go study abroad. And some, it's just been the last year, and that's been really interesting as well. So yeah, quite a lot of differences. And all of this is based on two main sources of data. On one side, we have the Studyportals behavioral data, where we're looking at what are students browsing for, what type of destinations are we looking at, what type of disciplines are we looking at. And on the other side, we had the Unibuddy data, which was what is top of mind for these students? What kind of topics do they bring about in conversations? What do they really care about? What do they worry about? Because those are the topics that come back. And I think this allows you to look at, okay, so on one side, what do students do and what do students think about? And it's a really interesting mix and wealth of data. So if we take Sri Lanka as an example, we have seen a significant amount of interest from Sri Lanka over the past years, and it has been growing, but it has been growing to some interesting destinations, for instance. So we saw that this year, so over the last 12 months, Sri Lanka has been showing a significant amount of interest growth towards Finland. And of course, we try to wrap our minds around why Finland, because that's what we do behind the scenes when we go look into something. Oftentimes it is about financial incentives. So it's usually something to do with, scholarship was introduced here. That's why we're seeing a significant amount of interest towards a particular destination or another. We have seen overall growth towards Canada as a study destination for most of the origins we're looking at. But for Sri Lanka, Canada was, again, a very significant destination increase, which does mean that it's competing with Australia, significantly more, with the United Kingdom, significantly more, with the US, significantly more. But it has been really, really interesting. And also, if we look at, for instance, Pakistan, their second most interesting destination country growing is China, which is a lot more regional. So we're seeing a lot more regional competition. If we look at Bangladesh, we see quite a bit of European interest, so Czech Republic, Portugal, not your traditional destinations either. And if we look at Nepal, we see interest going towards the UAE or Europe. So it's really been shifting. These are not the volume destinations, so it can be, but volume-wise, we're still looking at US, UK, Australia, but these are the ones that are growing the fastest. So there is something there pushing students to these markets, which is really interesting. We've also noticed that there's a lot of regional differences in terms of disciplines. So if we look at Sri Lanka and Pakistan, there's a lot of interest growth towards agriculture and forestry. We see education and training being really relevant for both Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. We see journalism in Bangladesh, which is quite interesting as well. But let's say Nepal being more focused on hospitality. And in terms of what students think, we do see some patterns within the area, which is that most of them do need to talk about money, want to talk about money. They are worried about finances. So I think whatever you can do in your marketing, in your messaging as well, to make it very clear as to what are the costs for them, what are the opportunities for financing, what are the opportunities for scholarships, what are the loans available to them. That's really going to help ease a bit of the anxiety that they have maybe about studying abroad. And the other thing we've noticed is that admissions, because for most of them, being able to kind of equate the degree to the country that we're going to be studying in is a bit more difficult. Not every destination is used to recruiting students from these countries or knowing exactly, okay, so what does a degree from Pakistan equate to in Australia or in Singapore? So therefore, this is something that they are worried about. And for Sri Lankan students, it seems that careers seems to be a bit more relevant to them as well. So what can they do afterwards if they study this degree in education and training? What are their job opportunities in the future? If we switch very quickly to beyond China, so here we see a few interesting patterns as well. So we do see kind of the regional interest for destinations. So for Vietnam, it's China, Russia. For Philippines, it's Singapore. For Thailand, it's Singapore, New Zealand. For Singapore, it's Thailand and China. So it does seem that there's a lot more kind of regional growth of interest, which is really fascinating. And we see a lot of kind of environmental studies. I think especially for Vietnam and Thailand and Malaysia. I think Vietnam and Thailand have been affected by quite significant floods recently, so therefore their interest towards environmental studies has been growing quite a bit. We see journalism in the Philippines growing quite a bit as well. So it is really interesting options, and depending on how broad your portfolio is, you can really start taking advantage of it. And in terms of what's top of mind for students, we do see quite a lot of interest in the what to study. So what is the course? What can I really study? What's the modules in it? So I think that is something to really focus when you're targeting or trying to recruit from these students. And for Philippine students, we also notice that money is a really big topic. So yeah, try to focus on that for Filipino students. I'm guessing that just having, even if it's a small scholarship, what we've noticed is that if students apply for a scholarship, they're already a lot more invested in studying at the university, even if they don't get the scholarship. So this could be a good strategy to attract students from particular regions, even if you don't have a huge budget to allocate to scholarships or financial aid. Well, Europe, it's a bit more my hometown because I am based in the Netherlands at the moment. So Portugal, Greece, Poland, these are countries that we continuously hear about from European universities. The what to study is really important to them. They really want to know the course. They want to know, what am I going to study? Is it this module, this module? You have to have that absolutely clear. If there's electives, what are they? Are they relevant to them? And what we've noticed for them is, I mean, for Portugal, it was quite surprising to see the growth of interest for China. We expected Ireland, that is because, of course, we had Brexit recently, and therefore a lot of students that were previously considering the UK are now considering Ireland as an alternative study destination. But China was a bit of a surprise. And I think if Chinese universities are starting to recruit in Europe, it means that a lot more universities can recruit in Europe. We also saw a lot of interest, let's say, from Greece going to Japan. And we thought, oh my, that is so interesting. It's, you know, the other way that we've normally seen student flows of interest going. So it's been quite fascinating to see it. And it was the same with Poland because China came up again. So I do think there's been quite an interesting shift in where students are considering their options. And if you keep in mind that, I think in terms of English taught programs, there's more options than ever. And I think especially universities within APAC are increasing their off-board English taught programs at a significant rate. It is not surprising that basically demand is following supply. So the more program choices, the more student interest goes that way as well. And well, last but definitely not least, so we have these kind of interesting outlier countries. So we looked at Brazil, Turkey, Japan as for interest. And again, they'll look a bit different. So let's say if we look at Brazil, their biggest, you know, growing destination country is actually Finland. And well, I have also spoken to a lot of Finnish universities who worry that, yes, but our climate is very different. Are they aware of that? And we're trying to find ways to kind of accommodate the diversity of, you know, having to accommodate somebody that hasn't seen snow yet, or, you know, is not accustomed to a really cold climate or really a lot of darkness, and trying to have services on campus for students to kind of adapt to the Nordic climate. But we've also seen a lot of interest, of course, from Turkey going to China. I think the trade part is definitely encouraging that because there's a lot of kind of economic ties between China and Turkey at the moment. So that is really incentivizing that shift. And from Japan, and that was the most fascinating one, we saw interest towards Hungary. And we've actually spoken to a few Japanese students and Japanese universities about it. And it does seem to be one of these trendy things at the moment. And they've also explained to us that that's also one of the interesting characteristics of Japan. Sometimes if something becomes incredibly popular, even for just a year, you can kind of capture student interest from the country for as long as that is trendy. So we had that with Italy as well at some point because Italian and Japanese languages are considered to be very similar, and therefore students were kind of wanting to experience the both. So we saw Italian students going to Japan and we saw Japanese students going to Italy. And as you can see, they're also slightly different in what is important to them. So for Japan, the course is really important. What are they going to study? For Turkey, is a bit more of the finance and the course mix. For Brazil, a bit the course and the financial part as well, because of course, Brazil is a growing economy, but it's still not as strong as some of the destinations that the students are looking at. So it's always a bit of a relative question of where you're looking to study, what is the affordability in the country. And I think the interesting part of both Brazil and Turkey was the interest towards environmental studies growing at the same time. So it's a good indicator, I think, and also an indicator that we are starting to deal with a new type of student. And we've noticed that Generation Z is a lot more sustainability driven. They do care more about gender equality, about political activism, about environmental studies. So it is something that we see come up over and over again in some of the research we've done as well. But we didn't want to just present, we also wanted to have a bit of a debate. So I'll pass it over back to you, Debbie, now. I think you're still muted.
Thank you. There's a common problem when it comes to presentation webinar. You forgot to unmute yourself. Yeah, let me just quickly. Yeah, I just want to say thank you so much, Carmen, for the detailed presentation. It is very interesting to see how students' interests and demands differ from country to country. It is such a great framework for universities or all education providers to look at and also apply this into their current strategy. And I think it's also interesting to highlight that diversification is not just about reducing the risk of being too dependent on single source country. And diversity is also not limited to the nationality of the students that recruit. So I think for this discussion part, I would like to ask a few questions from the eyes of the reader, and then further explores what this report and also all these insights indicate, and what are the actionable steps. And I guess my first question is probably the background. Like, what was the motivation behind writing this report?
Well, I think for us, the main motivation has been, and with a lot of the content that we write, how can we best serve our industry? Because we do know that diversity is so important to everybody, and diversification in particular, but we also know it can be overwhelming. So whenever we speak to our clients, they do say, well, I need to diversify, but where do I start? And it's always a bit difficult. And of course, every university has their core focus countries. We always have 10, maybe 15 countries. If you get beyond that, is it really a focus? But they always try to balance with, the need for focus with the need for that I also need to be looking elsewhere, because if I'm only focusing on a few countries, then there might be missed opportunities outside. And the question is always, how do you balance, but also how do you start? Because you don't have all the time to research each of these countries. You don't have the time to think what is new with them. And even, we could have, for instance, said, well, instead of looking at the top growing countries, we look at the top volume countries, but then that didn't tell you a lot of information in terms of, well, what is actionable and what is changing in the country, because we can all read reports from 2 years ago, but it doesn't tell you the current state. So we wanted to make it current, we wanted to make it relevant, and we also wanted to make it actionable. So it's not just, India is interesting, or beyond India is interesting, but can you give me more detail, and can you help me do the research so I don't have to do it myself?
Well, I totally relate to this. When I was doing student recruitment before my role at Unibuddy, I think diversification has always been one of the goals that we want to achieve. But sometimes it's not easy to find the right source countries. Sometimes it's really hard just to pick up the first step to really start the process. So having all these data, all these insights, even just like been the actionable steps are really helpful for diversity or even just different types of education providers. Oh, is my internet okay?
It's a bit spotty. I was wondering if it's mine, but
yeah, I think
now,
it was mine.
it's fine.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So yeah, I guess my second question is, as you presented earlier, that this report identified 17 promising countries for diversification. Like, how did you choose these countries and why you chose them?
Well, there were a few things that went into the selection process. I think on one side, we really tried to go for, oh, I'm really sorry, 1 second.
No problem. Oh, I think Carmen, you're on mute. Yeah, here you
No
go.
worries, sorry. What I was trying to say is there were a few reasons. So on one side, we had the fact that we didn't want to have the obvious choices, because I think everybody's thought about certain countries that we're already recruiting from, and we wanted to say, okay, let's go with the ones that maybe are a bit less familiar, but still really promising. And we defined promising by really noticing a lot of growth in terms of student interest year on year. So even if, let's say, they're a small country now, it does mean that they do have a lot of potential in the future. And also we wanted to have diversity in terms of the destination. So, for Europe, recruiting from Portugal, easy. It's kind of second nature. But if you're not a European institution, it is different. If you are Australian or an Asia Pacific university, of course, recruiting from Thailand, Vietnam is, again, second nature to you. It's countries that you're used to, it's countries that you're familiar with. But if you're a South American university, it's going to be completely new. So we wanted to have a bit of diversity in terms of something for everybody, because it is all relative in the end. So I hope you'll find something that works for you as well, and that you thought, oh, I never thought maybe I could recruit students from Poland. That is interesting. We should have a look at that.
Definitely. And I think that obviously having students from different countries and different backgrounds enhance the quality of the classroom experience. Yeah, I remember in my previous school when I was doing the recruitment, a lot of like parents, agents, or even just students themselves. One of the questions they would ask is the nationality mix, because they want to make sure they have this global sort of like experience community on the campus, rather than obviously just enhance the whole experience during their study journey.
Indeed. And I mean, we've noticed that with domestic students as well. So, if for them, the ratio of domestic to international students is not balanced, and let's say if it's one domestic student with 9 internationals, it does feel out of balance. And I think it's for both. So we noticed that the domestic students will then say, well, I do feel like I'm missing a bit of the background or the ability to relate to other domestic students. But then we also noticed that the internationals are saying, but I wanted to come to country X because I wanted to interact with the local students. And where are they? Why are they not in the classroom? It's always really interesting trying to get the right balance. And even then, international can mean 3 nationalities, or it can mean 20 within the same classroom. And that's where you get the breadth of perspective.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think this kind of like leads to my next question. Well, expanding new source countries is very important, as we have been discussing about. However, how do you balance focus countries with countries to diversify into?
I think it's the most difficult question for every team working in this field, because we always kind of end up calling it the 80-20 rule. So you do want to make sure that in terms of recruitment, of course, how you're investing budgets, it could be that the bulk of it will still go towards things that have been tried and proved. So if you know that year on year, you are recruiting a significant amount of students from a particular country, region, of course, you do want to keep that going. but maybe assign 20% of the other resources to exploring new countries, exploring new markets. The challenge is often, though, that effort-wise tends to sometimes be the other way around. So, recruiting for those like smaller countries that you're not used to in the beginning takes a long time until you've really honed, okay, what works, which channels, which agents, which events, which partners do I get on board? And sometimes that's more effort intensive. But once you do find kind of the magical combination that works for a particular country, you can kind of just go like take it towards your focus countries and keep it running instead of continuously having to innovate. But I do feel like it's one of the biggest challenges that every team has in terms of international student recruitment, between do we do what we've always done, do we try new things, and how do we kind of balance the effort in that sense?
Yeah, definitely.
How did you used to do it?
That's the thing. I think the reality is you only have like one bulk of budget, right? So so you have like, least amount of resources. Yes, the idea of, expanding to new source countries is really important because you don't want to be too dependent on, single source. But in the meantime, it is risky to like, well, not risky. I just say you should really just come to find a good balance when it comes to investing in new source countries, or even just find, your first step to start the process. So yeah, it is definitely, well, when I did at that time, it took a lot of like internal discussion and a lot of like external conversation with, stakeholders or, industry colleagues, try to get like different insights. But I think at that time, like we didn't have like data or, a report such like this, come like a concrete framework that you can basically pin your strategy on. So I think, yeah, definitely it is difficult. So make sure you do a lot of homework and research, and a lot of conversation need to be, taken around this topic.
Indeed.
So maybe move into a bit more like specific when it comes to source country. What are the most important criteria to include and exclude a country from your list? I guess that's probably the early, start process.
Yeah, and actually that brings me to one of the questions we have in the Q&A as well. So, okay, so how do you overcome maybe the language barriers when you try to recruit from a different country or from a new one? And I think the answer to at least one of my suggestions to both is do try to use some of the student resources that you currently have already. So let's say maybe you've already had one or two students from a particular country that you think is really, really interesting. And I do think you can use them as resources or ambassadors to try to recruit more students, in that they're going to help you understand, okay, what is the education system in the country? When is a good time to recruit from there? So kind of what is the academic year structure like? When do students start thinking about it? Which channels do they use in that particular country? And of course, do keep in mind that so a lot of the data that we presented here today is about students that are going abroad to teach in English, and therefore they are expected to have a certain level of English. So you will probably not have to translate everything to the local language. It is good to get the understanding of the local of the country, of the education system, of marketing channels, etc. But it does not mean that if you do have an English top program and that's the one that you're trying to recruit students from, then the language barrier is not as high as it is for maybe other local programs. If the students do need additional education support with their English, then of course you can look at pre-masters, pre-bachelors, kind of summer schools or language school to kind of help bridge that English language gap. But oftentimes we notice that, I mean, that's also one of the main reasons why universities are so successful teaching in English, is because it kind of takes away the language barrier and it does make it a bit more accessible. What other criteria to look at, I think, is, so on one side, have you ever had student there, because that helps you get that knowledge. It can also be really important is what is your portfolio, and what is the interest in those countries. Because if you have a portfolio that is, for instance, really focused on environmental studies, or if sustainability is a really big theme at your university, you do want to find the countries that are really interested in that discipline or sub-discipline in particular. So for instance, when we did a similar study in the past, we noticed that some of the countries growing the fastest in interest in sustainability or environmental studies were the ones that were going to be most affected by global warming or climate change. So for instance, we had countries like Costa Rica or Bhutan, or well, in the reports we had Thailand and we had Vietnam, because if they're naturally inclined to study something, then it's a lot easier to do your recruitment activities in a particular country if you offer that portfolio of courses. We also know that, for instance, Vietnam and Mexico were significantly interested in business above all else, a bit the same with the Middle East. So therefore, if you're a business school, those are really more natural recruitment countries to consider. If you want engineering, there's a lot of countries that are very much tech oriented. There's a few countries that are computer science, data science oriented. So kind of finding the right discipline approach per country is going to make a big difference. And I think also we're underestimating sometimes maybe some of the government relations that come with particular countries. So we've noticed that if suddenly a scholarship becomes available for students from, I think it was it Austria as a destination and students from Vietnam. So at some point, there was a Vietnamese-Austrian scholarship program assembled together. It wasn't very popular, as in like universities themselves didn't really know about it. They just noticed the inflow of students because the students learned about it faster than the university did. But it was a really good way of saying, oh, okay, that makes it so much easier to be able to recruit from particular countries if we set up these kind of funds and mutual agreements. So those are, I think, also things to look into in terms of, is there something we can take advantage and use for our strategy?
Definitely.
Any other
And I
tips
think,
from you, Debbie?
yeah, I wanted to add that, well, obviously when we're talking about, part of the early process is to select the source country that you can, recruit from. But as you mentioned earlier, it also kind of like tie into the question we have in the Q&A, which is also related to the early process of, diversification to overcome the language barrier. That's probably one of the top questions you will have in mind when you try to expand to the new country. So on that note, I would also like to add the point that one of the most efficient ways is to utilize the voice of your current students from those new source countries to engage with prospective students there. So your students' experiences and background can resonate with the prospective students more than your newsletters, your marketing campaign, or your agents. Also, it is a more cost-effective way to bridge the language gap between your team and the prospective students without committing expensive resources such as a local representative or agency in the beginning. So definitely include current students in the process of diversification is definitely recommended. This is what I did back in my time. I kept talking about my previous experience.
But I think it's really relevant.
Yeah, it is really relevant to kind of like share my past experience. So when I was doing a student recruitment at that time, the idea that I had at that time is to kind of like create community for students from different countries, so they can feel, okay, your institution is really international, but they still able to basically find their niche in the institution. Yeah,
I think it's a good strategy.
It is, yeah. And also it's, again, cost effective as well. So it's a smart and also effective way to do it. And I think, sorry.
And I think also we're underestimating sometimes just how much you can get done these days just with digital marketing and recruitment, because you don't even need to physically be in a country to be able to test the value proposition. I think the internet has changed quite a lot, and I think everybody having to resort to digital recruitment over the past years because travel was not an option, in event was not an option, and meeting agents in person was not an option. Did open quite a few perspectives in terms of there are maybe more efficient ways of doing things, and looking online, looking into digitalizing maybe the recruitment process is a good way forward for quite a few universities, especially if you want diversity, because like you're saying, Debbie, you don't need to be physically present in a country. You can do a lot of things just from behind your desk, testing them out and seeing what works.
Definitely. And I guess what we have been talking about, different ways to do diversification. And I also mentioned that it's really useful to have, all this data, all these insights. But obviously students, interest or, the trends, vary from time to time. So I guess my final question, which is a question, probably a lot of audience here would relate, is how can the university or institution stay up to date with the latest trends for topics or of interest, from prospective students and keep it regionalized?
I think that's a challenge because it's difficult to be up to date on everything all the time. I mean, you can read the news continuously and have your news alert for that particular country, but I do think it is a challenge, and also a lot of what we read in the media, of course, is also filtered through each of the institutions reporting on it. Some of that we've noticed is quite outdated data. So if you look at, let's say, numbers from UNESCO, OECD in terms of particular source countries, by the time you get to them, they're a bit, outdated already. Of course, I am biased because we do have real-time behavioral data on what students are doing. And also I'm saying doing because oftentimes what they say they do and what they actually do can be very different. So, if I would ask a Vietnamese student, are they considering Austria for their top recruitment, top destination countries? Most of them will probably say no, but in the behavioral data, I can see that they are, because they are looking at the programs and they are clicking on this program website. So therefore, sometimes behavioral data is a bit more reliable than self-reported data. So even if you look at student surveys or quizzes, oftentimes they can be a bit biased by what students think that they should be portraying to the world or saying to the world. But yeah, I do think trying to keep on top of things, trying to get as many data sources as possible in terms of monitoring what's happening, keeping up to date, but still making it feasible. And I mean, like we said, there's only a certain amount of budget and a certain amount of time. So having something that works across multiple countries is probably preferred. And I'm guessing anybody also has quite a few solutions for that as well.
Yes, so I was going to add that apart from what you have just shared, I also want to highlight that is having the access to what your prospective students are asking, and also their profiles in terms of where are they based and also what course they are interested, can really help you to be on top of the current trends and tailor your strategy based on what your students really think. So obviously do the research and get data from like a bigger pictures, but also it's important to look at, individual conversations, what are the questions they're asking. Okay, so I think this leads to our next slide beautifully. So let me just quickly share my screen. Okay, can you see my screen well?
Not yet. Yes, no,
yeah.
Oh,
sorry. Yeah, it's my here we go. Cool. So I want to take some time to point out that how we can help with diversification, because this is a topic of to this webinar. And I guess the first step is to make the international connection. It's not easy to start the process of diversifying source countries, as we previously discussed, especially students' demand and interests vary from time to time, from country to country. So placing peer-to-peer engagement on your website allows your prospective students to start the conversation with current students who share the same language, the same background, or home countries. So that will make them feel they can speak to someone who understands them, and also allow them to recognize that you have a global community of students on the campus where they will be able to, find their own. And I guess we also talk about, the importance of, understanding what your students want, and also stay on top of the latest trends, and also having access of these data insights. So this is something, thank you, Carmen, for pointed out earlier. This is something that Unibuddy actually specializes in with our conversational data, which is collected by AI based on these conversations between your current students and prospective students. And the data is segmented by different criteria, such as time period, country, area of study, and topic, so that you can realize the spectrum of your prospects and homing on your target markets. And I think the third point, it's more tech savvy side of things, is the integration with your CRM. So Unibuddy can assist you in tracking your prospective students through the admission cycle by integrating the platform with your CRM system. So this integration allows you to access leads from across the world only in one place. It can help you conclude whether or not students have applied, deposited, or enrolled. So you have the visibility of which students from where are actually progressing through the entire cycle. And then you can gauge where you should focus your recruitment efforts to promote a diverse student population. And I think lastly, create a sense of belonging amongst international prospects. Try to differentiate your institution by engaging and supporting international students at every stage of the recruitment process. I think I mentioned earlier that the power of using community, group of your students on their specific topic, and then provide the support and engagement throughout their journey with your institution. Oh, I think here you go. So I will stop sharing my screen now.
No worries. And I think, just building on what you're saying, Debbie, I do think that students are really craving that personal connection in the digital world. So I do think it's quite valuable to give them somebody to talk to in person. Now, of course, on the how Studyportals can support you in your diversification journey, we do have the advantage of having a very global platform. So we know that there's always about 52 million visitors per year around the world coming to search for the best study option, whether they're at the beginning of the student journey, or maybe they're just shortlisting the universities they want to apply to, or maybe they've gotten accepted, but they're just trying to compare what is the best option for them towards the end. So I do think this just gives you that kind of global brand perspective in terms of being able to say, okay, we can reach a lot of students, therefore there's a lot of options in terms of global brand recognition and countries to recruit from. I think we have students from over 200 countries and territories, so it does give you that option of being visible in a country without necessarily having to have a physical presence there. I do think also, because we work on a results-based partnership, depending on what the result it is that you're looking for, whether it's leads, enrollments, applications, it is a really good way of getting your strategic enrollment goals. And it does mean that this way your budget, because we talked about budget allocation, is very clear, because you're only going to be paying for the results that you're getting. So you're not paying just for exposure or visibility, but it really is, I want to recruit students from a particular country. That's where your investment is going to go. So it's a really nice way of being able to make that distinction between focus countries and new opportunities that we talked about earlier. And of course, I think You do want to have quite a bit of control over your student recruitment funnel. You do want to make sure that you're engaging with your students, that you're very clear in how you want to position programs and how you want to position university. And doing that digitally is a really nice, consistent way of doing it. And of course, adding the data and the insights to that does make sure that you're going to have the right portfolio to be recruiting in the countries that you're interested in. And also that if you do set your eyes on a particular source country and you want to add that to your portfolio of countries to recruit from, that you can make kind of data informed decisions as to what is the best way to go forward, what are students that are interested, what is top of mind for them. Because then you're going to be able to be efficient about how you're going to go about approaching new countries and new source opportunities. So I think it all kind of comes together to give you a bit of both the global visibility that I think everybody's looking for, as well as the results that are really important to make sure that the strategy actually turns into achieves its goals and turns into results, and of course the data to kind of make it all a bit seamless so that you don't have to spend efforts on things that may not work in the end. And I also wanted to share just a few additional resources because in the past we've done similar reports also on Asia focus or Africa focus. So if you're curious about additional countries, I think there's more wealth information out there. So I do think it's useful to have a read, go through everything. And even if they were published about 6 months ago, I think a lot of the information for some of the source countries doesn't change. And it is quite valuable to take action now still.
Yeah, definitely. I have allocated some time to read the Asia focus one. So I will keep posted on my feedback. Yeah. So yeah, I just want to say, as mentioned in the beginning, we have left some time, Alian, to answer some questions from our audience. So I can see we have got two questions at the moment. So the first one is how to increase the level of engagement with students in new market countries. I guess this come like covered in some information that we shared earlier. I will talk about from our side, and then so maybe Carmen can share some inputs from your end too. So about the level of engagement with the students, obviously utilizing your current students would be definitely one of the good ways to do so. So you can create the peer-to-peer experience sharing, which is authentic, so they can hear from someone who have made that journey. And obviously that will increase the level of engagement or the level of trust they have with the information that they receive. And in the meantime, we mentioned about Unibuddy community. It is important and also helpful to create this sense of belonging, which will also be able to increase the level of engagement with your prospects. So I think that's probably 2 points from me. How about you, Carmen?
I think I would agree, and what I would add is just making sure that you focus on the market fit with the students in that country. So what we've noticed is that there's even quite a lot of regional differences. So even if you take huge country like India, if you want to recruit from Mumbai, focusing on your business programs, because that's what students in Mumbai are really interested in, versus if you have an engineering program aiming it towards students more from the Chennai region, that really makes a big difference in terms of being able to kind of get the results you're looking for that particular country. And I do think it's going to increase the level of engagement students have, because they're just going to have a more kind of natural inclination towards particular disciplines or offering that you have. And I also noticed that Germana was asking about the sources of the data. So there's 2 sources of the data on the behavioral side, so on the choice of destinations, on the choice of disciplines, or the growth of interest towards particular discipline. That's where we used Studyportals data. We've also used quite a bit of publicly available data, so we always related back to kind of demographic data or socioeconomic data. And on the topics that students were addressing, that's where we used the Unibuddy data to see, okay, so what is top of mind for students in a particular source country, and what is it that they're interested in discussing, or what do they have questions about, what is relevant to them, basically.
Yeah, exactly, which is the conversational insights that were mentioned earlier. So you know what your students are really thinking about, and also what they want at that time, because we mentioned, the demands and interests vary from time to time. So it's important to come like on top of all these conversations at the latest stage. Okay, cool. Wow, time flies. I think it's time for us to wrap up for today's webinar. I want to say thank you all so much for joining us today, and we hope you find the conversation today very helpful. I would also like to say, oh, here, thank you, Carmen. Yeah,
No.
I would also like to say thank you so much to Carmen for co-writing such an insightful report, and I really enjoyed today's session very much. I reason maybe there will be some, more other questions, but we don't have time to cover for this time. Here are our contact details. So please reach out to us if you have any further questions, or maybe you just simply want to explore a little bit further, then we will be more than happy to help. Okay.
Thank you, Debbie, for having me. It's been a really nice pleasure. And well, reach out if you have questions. I think we can always continue the conversation after the webinar as well.
Perfect, will do. Thank you, Carmen, and hope to see you all somewhere again very soon, to our audience, and enjoy the rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.